All right, this is our brief overview of the International Monetary Fund, so you can at least ace part of your test. All right, so the first thing that needs to be known is what was the purpose of creating the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. And it was started because in the 1920s and 30s-ish, countries still had the belief that they should maximize exports and minimize imports, and this led to what we call competitive devaluation of their currency. And what this means is that in order to stimulate exports and make them cheaper and also prevent imports, nations would intentionally devalue their currency. And this led to a kind of like a race to the bottom of sorts, in which countries just keep devaluing and it's unsustainable. And that's ultimately what led to kind of a global collapse, just solely due to the fact that people viewed trade as a zero-sum game and killed their currencies. So as such, the International Monetary Fund was created as a means to monitor international currency between nations. And it served to make sure that this didn't happen again and keep currencies relatively stable against each other. And it has, as such, it has multiple powers. In particular, surveillance is when it actually monitors countries' different currencies. It goes in, they can do it in a bilateral, which is when they just go to a specific country. Big countries like the US are every 2 years. Smaller countries are every 6 years because they're less important. And basically they just bring in advisors, economists, and they talk to like the heads of the central banks, finance ministers, whatever it needs to be done. And with them, they can determine, this is where the state of the economy is, this is the state of the currency. And after they do that, they're able to then look and say, all right, this is where we think your country is going. Perhaps you should do this, this, and this. Make some suggestions, offer advice to better give an outside opinion, third-party opinion on how to better improve your economy and prevent any instability. Multilateral is essentially the same thing, except instead of looking at one country, you're looking at entire regions, or in fact the entire world. They do it on both levels, so they'll look at like the EU, they'll look at like South America, the Mercantile, or and they also do the entire world every year. Finally, you have the general data dissemination, I have to actually cheat on that one, system. And essentially what it is it's just the IMF standards on how countries are supposed to record their financials. And the reason for that is if countries follow these standards, there's at least a minimum level of quality, so we are better able to monitor the currency status of different nations. And then the special data dissemination system is basically the same thing. It's complementary to the GDDS, and all it is basically these outlines for how countries need to share their financial information so other countries can understand the current situation in each country. Basically, also on the surveillance, I mentioned the technical advice. They are really smart, so they offer all their opinions all the time, whether countries like it or not. But what they're most known for is lending money. They're also known as the lender of last resort. Greece really knows them. They're buddies. And it comes with this really important clause that makes it much more controversial than what we'll learn about later, the World Bank. And the reason why they're so controversial is in order to get a loan from the IMF, regardless if it's a commercial grade loan or like a giveaway, you have to meet what's called IMF conditionality. And what this means is basically if you want the IMF's money, they're happy to give it to you. But along with the surveillance and technical assistance, they're going to make you have a bunch of things that you have to do in order to be worthy of the money. And basically what it is it's changes that need to be made so you can actually have a chance of repaying back the loan. And what's important is they don't necessarily actually say exactly what you need to do. But for example, they'll tell it like Greece, you need to be able to cut this much out of this part of your budget. And then Greece has to present to them the ways they're going to actually make these budget cuts or raise revenue or whatever it may be. And then so they have loans, different types, non-concessional.
Non-consensual.
Yeah, they usually have to consent one way or the other. It might take a little forcing, but it's okay. And basically it's a commercial grade loan with the interest rate being determined by the special drawing rights, which we'll talk about later. And then we have concessional loans, which are either 0% or low interest. And these are for the poorest of nations. So these are more for middle income nations versus, really, really desperate and poor countries. It's got to be a combination to get the concessional loan. And then we lead into the special drawing rights that the book loves to talk about, but kind of skipped like what seemed to be a few pages. And essentially what it is, and the reason for it is, because originally countries used to keep big stocks of American currency, the US dollar. And what happened was eventually there was so much pressure on the US dollar because every single country was using it to make foreign payments that the demand for the US dollar just was too high for the gold standard. And it just was unfeasible. And eventually the IMF realized that it would lead to an unstable currency situation. So instead what they did to reduce the pressure, they created the special drawing right, which is a global currency. And it's composed of a US dollar, a British pound sterling, the euro, and Japanese yen. And basically what it does is it distributes the pressure on the four most powerful currencies in the world. And by doing so, it also makes it more stable as a currency. And it allows foreign payments to be made. It's essentially just writing in a book. There's no actual change of money. The IMF holds all the money, but it just exchanges it between the nations. As far as its usage, the book's really unclear. What you have to understand, the takeaway I got from it was used, then it wasn't used. Don't really know when that happened. And since 2008, people have actually started making use of it again. But the details aren't really clear in the book. Finally, we want to talk about how the IMF is actually governed. And first off, you got the Board of Governors. These are the lazy pricks who, they are like the heads of central banks, finance ministers, whatever. They only meet like once a year. They can meet more, but I don't think they really do. And essentially, they delegate all their power to the executive board. But first, let's talk about what powers they retain. They have the power to designate the special drawing rights to each nation, how much global currency each nation has. They have the power to vote in new nations to the International Monetary Fund. They also have the power to kick people out. And yeah, that's about it. Voting power, very important. It's based on how much each nation contributes to the International Monetary Fund. So for example, in 2008, the US had over 16% voting power for just one vote. So that's kind of cool. Some countries have like less than 1%. Kind of sucks for them, but they probably actually are the ones using the loans. And then you got the executive board. There's only 24 seats. Most of them are, some of them are for one country, like the US, Russia, China, France, UK. They all have their own country, own governor. Other ones are made up of random countries. I think it's like there's some Middle Eastern country in the same group as Switzerland, for example. Don't really know how they would vote the same, but whatever it is. And again, it is weighted. And for the governors who are made up of multiple countries, their weight is determined by the total contributions of all their different nations combined. How they determine who represents what countries, no idea. The book just said it's a complex formula. And then finally, the executive board promotes a IMF managing director who represents the IMF in all its international affairs. Basically, for all of the associations, including the UN, they don't really care about him. Just the fact that it's, the head of the IMF in terms of like what everybody sees. That's all you kind of have to know. Just know his name. And there you go.
You fucking killed it.